The museum's annex had no windows, which meant it had no weather, which meant that whatever happened inside it happened for reasons that belonged entirely to the building itself. Desmond Okafor had understood that distinction since his second year on the job, though it took him another decade to understand what it actually meant. Harold Voss had told him, more or less in those words, during Desmond's first month. Out there, things happen because of rain or heat or somebody leaving a window open. In here, if something happens, it's because the building did it. Nothing else is allowed in. Harold had run the physical plant at the Kessler County Natural History Museum for 31 years by the time Desmond arrived as his junior facilities technician. He was heavy-set, soft-voiced, with the unhurried patience of someone who spent 3 decades in rooms where nothing was supposed to move quickly, a climate system built to keep the past from continuing to decay. Harold didn't train Desmond so much as let him watch, the way you let someone watch weather. What Harold left behind, when he retired in 1998, was a shoebox of index cards, 1 card per cabinet row in the specimen annex, each one recording humidity readings, drawer counts, and any anomaly Harold had thought worth noting. Going back to 1971, not a maintenance log. Something closer to a diary the building had been keeping about itself, transcribed by a man patient enough to listen. Desmond had read every card in the box during his first month with it. Most were unremarkable. Humidity holding steady, a drawer sticking in July, a light fixture replaced. But 1 card, for aisle 12, entomology, had an entry that Desmond returned to more than any other in the years that followed. Asterisk February 1974. Humidity spike, aisle 12, unclear source. Log 2:40 a.m. to approximate 4:10 a.m. HVAC service log shows no fault, no cycle irregularity. Check door seals, intact. Check drainage below slab, dry, no sign of intrusion. Recurred following February, same week, similar duration. Watching, asterisk. Below it, a second entry, dated 3 years later, asterisk February 1977. Again, same aisle, same window. Cannot explain. Filed as recurring unexplained event. Will continue monitoring annually. Asterisk. There was no third entry on the card. Harold's cards ended when his tenure ended, in 1998, 24 years after the first note. Desmond had asked him about it once, near the end, over coffee in a break room that doubled as Harold's office. You never figured out what it was, Desmond said. It wasn't quite a question. Harold turned his cup slowly on the table. I figured out what it wasn't, he said. That took most of the 30 years. What it was, I ran out of time before I ran out of guesses. He looked at Desmond for a moment. You'll have more time than I did, he said. Don't waste it assuming the mechanical system is telling you the whole truth. It only tells you what's built to measure. The annex had been built in 1966, a low, windowless brick structure connected to the main museum by an underground service corridor, designed entirely around the needs of specimens rather than people. No natural light, because light degraded organic material. Constant humidity control, because moisture swings crack pinned insect wings and warped taxidermy mounts. 12 long aisles of steel cabinetry, each a wall of shallow drawers, each drawer a small control world. Desmond had walked those aisles for 28 years. He knew the annex the way Harold had. Not through the official systems reporting tidy digital columns on a mechanical room monitor, but through smaller, older forms of attention that didn't show up on any screen. Which drawer stuck in August? That aisle 4 always smelled faintly of naphthalene, residue from mothball treatments decades out of use. The annex's sounds, the low hum of dehumidifiers, the click of the compressor cycling, the particular quiet of a room built to hold onto the past. He had continued Harold's card system after Harold left, not because anyone required it. The museum had adopted a digital environmental monitoring system in 2015, but because Desmond had come to believe what Harold believed. A sensor told you a number, and a number told you whether something crossed a threshold somebody decided mattered. It didn't tell you whether something was changing too slowly and too small to trip an alarm. The cards told you that, if you kept them long enough. He had watched aisle 12 every February since 1998. He had continued Harold's entries in his own hand, on the same card, the same format, date, duration, findings. He had checked the same things Harold checked: HVAC logs, door seals, drainage. Every single year, and every single year found nothing. The spike came. It lasted under 90 minutes. It always fell between 2 and 4 in the morning, always the same week in early February, though the exact night varied by a day or two year to year. He had a theory once, in his 8th year with the cards, that might be tied to the building's mechanical purge cycle, a scheduled defrost sequence in the dehumidification system that ran on a seasonal timer. He had checked the purge schedule against his humidity spike dates for 3 consecutive years, convinced he had found the answer. The purge cycle ran in mid-January. The humidity spike came 3 weeks later, in February every time. He had been wrong. He wrote that in the margin of the card plainly, the way Harold would have, asterisk purge cycle theory, ruled out, dates do not align, fact unknown, asterisk. He didn't like being wrong about it. He had wanted the explanation to be that simple. But the cards weren't for being right. They were for being accurate, which sometimes meant admitting you didn't know. In his 11th year with the cards, Desmond noticed something Harold's 24 years of notes had never had enough data points to show. He had been transcribing the current year's spike measurement, a peak relative humidity, reading the sensor log during the event, into a new column he'd started keeping on the back of the card, a simple habit of recording the exact peak number rather than just noting that a spike had occurred. He looked at the column that evening. 7 years of numbers stacked one below the other, and something in the shape of it caught his attention, the way a drawer that didn't sit quite flush caught his attention. The numbers weren't identical year to year. They were close, but they were climbing, not dramatically. A fraction of a percentage point most years, sometimes nothing at all, once a slightly larger jump that he'd assumed at the time was measurement noise. But laid out in a column, 7 years running, the trend was there. Small, consistent, real. He went back through Harold's 2 entries from the 1970s. Harold hadn't recorded exact peak percentages, only that a spike occurred and its approximate duration. There was no way to know, from Harold's notes alone, what the magnitude had been in 1974 or 1977. But if the growth Desmond was now seeing in his own 7 years of numbers had been happening at even a fraction of that rate across the full span since 1974, 50 years, not 7, then whatever was producing the spike had been getting slowly, patiently worse for a half a century. He sat with that in the break room after his shift, the same table where Harold had told him he'd run out of time before he ran out of guesses. He thought about what it would mean if something in this windowless building had been quietly building toward a threshold for 50 years, while every measurement anyone had ever taken said everything was fine. He didn't know what the threshold was. He didn't know if there was one. He only had a column of numbers, climbing. The digitization announcement came in September. The museum's collections division had secured a grant to begin imaging the non-display specimen collection, high-resolution scans that would let researchers worldwide study drawers of pinned insects without ever opening a physical cabinet. It was, everyone agreed, an excellent use of the funding. The scanning equipment required a dedicated, climate-stable installation space with minimal foot traffic and no risk of specimen contamination from public areas. Aisle 12 was selected. Its drawers would be relocated to consolidated cabinetry elsewhere in the annex, and the aisle itself would be clear to house the imaging rig, a precision optical scanner whose manufacturer's specification sheet, which Desmond read twice before he understood the significance of what he was reading, listed an operating humidity tolerance range with hard limits on either side. Above the upper limit, the equipment's warranty was void, and its optics were at risk of condensation damage. Desmond did the arithmetic that evening at his kitchen table. The spike's current magnitude, per his own 7 years of careful measurement, sat comfortably within the scanner's tolerance, for now. But the trend line, if it held even roughly steady, would cross that upper limit within a handful of years, possibly sooner, if the growth wasn't linear. He didn't know if it was linear. He only knew it hadn't been flat. He brought his cards to the facility's committee the following week. He brought all of them. Harold's original 2 entries, his own 26 years of continuation, the peak humidity column he'd started keeping, the arithmetic he'd done at his kitchen table, laid out in his own handwriting on a sheet of paper he'd stapled to the front. The committee listened politely. The HVAC contractor service records, going back to the entire digital monitoring era, showed zero mechanical faults associated with the annual event. No fault code, no service call, no documented cause. The prevailing conclusion in the room, offered gently, not dismissively, was that the recurring spike was most likely a sensor calibration artifact, a quirk in the reporting system rather than a real environmental event. Sensors drifted. Software updates sometimes introduced strange periodic errors that persisted until a firmware patch caught them. It's the same sensor Harold was reading in 1974? Desmond asked, though he already knew the answer. The physical system's been upgraded twice since then, the committee chair said, but the location's the same. If it were a real environmental event, we'd expect the HVAC system to show some corresponding load or fault. It never has. Desmond didn't have an engineering explanation for why a real event might leave no trace in the HVAC log. He only had 50 years of index cards saying the event was real and no explanation for what caused it, and a specification sheet saying the equipment they were about to install could not survive it forever. The installation proceeded on the approved timeline. It was scheduled to be operational by December, 2 months before the following February. He didn't sleep well that autumn. It wasn't only the installation. It was the shape of his own doubt, which kept changing depending on the hour. At 3 p.m, standing in aisle 12 watching the old cabinets being wheeled out, he was certain. The numbers were real. The trend was real. Something was coming and nobody would believe him until it arrived. At 3 a.m, lying awake, he wasn't certain of anything. He was a facilities technician with a shoebox of index cards, arguing with an HVAC service record that had never once, in 50 years of digital monitoring, shown a fault. What if Harold's cards had captured something real in the 70s that had simply stopped happening decades ago, and what Desmond had been chasing since 1998 was an echo, a habit of watching for something that wasn't there anymore, sustained by his own expectation rather than the building's behavior. He had wanted, for years, for the spike to mean something, wanting something to mean something was not the same as it meaning something. He went back through his own 26 years of entries one more time, slowly, the way you'd reread a letter looking for a tone you might have missed. The spikes were there, every year. He hadn't imagined them. The sensor log confirmed each one, even if the committee read those same confirmed spikes as artifacts rather than events. What he couldn't be sure was the cause, and what he couldn't be sure of, sitting in his kitchen at 3 a.m. with the shoebox open in front of him, was whether he was seeing a pattern or constructing one. Harold's voice came back to him from the break room. Years ago, asterisk, I figured out what it wasn't. That took most of the 30 years. Asterisk. Desmond had spent his own years finding out what it was in the HVAC system. Wasn't a purge cycle, wasn't a sensor drift the committee could explain away with a firmware update, because the committee hadn't actually checked whether firmware updates correlated with the pattern either. He had more of what it wasn't than Harold ever had. He didn't have what it was, but the scanner would be installed by December, and February would come whether or not anyone believed the shoebox. The scanning rig went into aisle 12 in the first week of December, exactly on schedule. Precision optics. Environmental sensors of its own, a manufacturer technician who flew in to complete the calibration and left behind a laminated card taped inside the housing listing the tolerance specifications Desmond had already memorized. Desmond kept walking his rounds. He checked aisle 12 the way he checked every aisle, noting nothing unusual through December and January. The humidity in that section, holding at its normal baseline, well within range, exactly as it always did outside the February window. In late January, with the anniversary approaching, he went to the collections director directly, bypassing the committee. Her name was Priya Anand, and she had been with the museum for 6 years, long enough to know Desmond by name, but not long enough to have any history with the shoebox. He laid it all out for her plainly, not asking her to override the committee's engineering judgment, only asking that someone monitor the scanner's condensation sensor manually during the first week of February, in addition to its automated logging, so that if something happened, there would be a human witness rather than only a data point someone could later dismiss as an artifact. She looked at the cards for a long moment, Harold's original 1974 entry, then Desmond's most recent peak humidity figure beneath it, 50 years and one continuous line of attention apart. You've been watching this for 26 years, she said. Harold watched it for 24 before me, Desmond said. 50 years combined. I know that doesn't mean I'm right, but it means somebody's been paying attention the whole time and nobody's ever explained it. She agreed to the manual check. It cost her nothing to agree to it, and it seemed, watching her face, that some part of the reason she agreed was the two entries themselves, the plain, careful, unembellished handwriting of two men across half a century, neither of them claiming to know more than they did. The spike came on February the 6th at 2:52 in the morning. Priya Anand was not there. Nobody expected the exact night, only the week. But the scanning rig's own environmental sensor was, and it logged what the museum's building system had always logged, a rapid climb in relative humidity, sustained for just under 90 minutes, then a gradual return to baseline. Except this time, the peak was higher than Desmond's arithmetic had projected, not by a catastrophic margin, but high enough that the scanning rig's condensation alarm triggered at 3:31 a.m., and the automated environmental log flagged an equipment fault for the first time since installation. The manufacturer's remote diagnostic team was on a call with the museum by 9 that morning. Desmond was in the room, at Priya's request, with his cards on the table. What followed took 3 more weeks to fully resolve, but the shape of the answer came faster than that. A facilities engineer brought in to assess the annex's substructure, not the HVAC system, which had never shown a fault because it had never been the source, but the concrete slab itself, found what 50 years of environmental monitoring had never been built to look for. Beneath aisle 12, buried in the original 1966 slab, ran a section of cast iron drainage pipe, a remnant of a specimen preservation wet lab that had operated in that space before the dry storage annex was built over it in a renovation nobody currently on staff had any memory of. The wet lab's plumbing had been decommissioned in 1970, valved off rather than fully capped and removed, a shortcut that seemed reasonable at the time and had simply been forgotten by the time anyone thought to ask. The site's original grading, before the annex existed, had followed the natural slope of a creek bed that ran through property decades before the museum was built. The creek was long gone, filled and paved over, but the water table beneath the site still rose and fell with seasonal rhythm tied to regional groundwater levels, a rhythm that reliably peaked in early winter and crested, most years, in the first weeks of February. Once a year, at that seasonal peak, groundwater pressure forced residual moisture up through a degrading joint in the old, forgotten pipe, releasing a brief pulse of humidity into the aisle above before draining back down as the pressure eased. It had likely been happening since the pipe was decommissioned in 1970. Harold had caught the tail end of its earliest documented years. Desmond had caught 50 years of it slowly getting worse, the joint's degradation compounding a fraction more with each seasonal cycle of pressure, exactly the trend as 7 years of peak humidity figures had shown. It had never shown up in the HVAC log because the HVAC system had never been the cause. It had only ever been the thing measuring the aftermath. The scanning rig was relocated to aisle 3, on the opposite side of the annex, once the pipe's location and pattern were fully mapped. The pipe itself was excavated, removed, and the slab properly sealed, a repair that took most of March and cost more than anyone had budgeted, though considerably less than a ruined imaging system and a lost grant would have cost. Priya Anand asked Desmond, near the end of it, whether he wanted the museum's official incident report to credit the card system by name. He thought about it for a moment. "Credit Harold," he said. "He started it. I just kept it going." She nodded and wrote it that way. The final report, filed in the museum's permanent facilities archive, noted that the anomaly had first been documented in 1974 by facility staff Harold Voss, and continuously monitored for 50 years through an informal card-based observation system maintained by his successor, Desmond Okafor, without which the underlying cause would likely not have been identified before equipment failure. Desmond kept the shoebox. The digital system had been updated, at his suggestion, to flag any recurring seasonal pattern for manual review rather than dismissing repeat anomalies as artifacts, a small change, buried in the settings menu nobody would ever think to look at unless they already knew to look. He still walked aisle 12 every February, out of habit more than necessity now that the pipe was gone and the pattern with it. He still kept the cards. He had started a new one for aisle 3, tracking the scanning rig's environment the old way, alongside the new sensors, because Harold had taught him that a number told you what it was built to measure, and a person who kept watching year after year sometimes noticed a thing the number wasn't built to see at all. The annex was quiet around him on those February mornings, windowless, weatherless, holding its collection of pinned and mounted and cataloged past in careful stillness. It had no accidents to blame anything on. Whatever it did because of something inside itself. Desmond had spent 28 years learning to listen for that. He didn't expect to stop.